Hey, welcome back everyone. And to follow up my very long previous video on setlist management, I think we're going with something a little bit shorter and faster today, but it was requested in a comment on that video, which is tempo control or tap tempo. And you're seeing a rare site on my QC where I have the tap tempo light turned on. That's pretty much a no-go for me 99% of the time. But it's required to illustrate some of the stuff going on today. So, enjoy it while it lasts. We've got a tap tempo light. So I'm going to try and cover a couple of ways to do this. The most basic and the one that I think people go to, or at least used to go to, was literally sending the tap tempo CC. So let's set that up. And this might still be what you want. So we'll just call this tap tempo. So in our world, the tap tempo for the QC is going to be a CC change. I think it's like CC 44. I'm going to try and guess. Look at that. Again, value doesn't matter. This is another thing that confuses people. And the way this is labeled, I can't blame them. It's labeled as tempo BPM. It should be labeled as tap tempo. And people are like, well, how do I set a tempo higher than 127? You're not setting the tempo value. Any CC value will work. You're literally just triggering as if you are pressing the physical stomp, much like the A through H stomp CCs. So you're not setting the value, you're just sending that tap. So if I save this, we see our tap tempo here. And if I start pressing it, you'll see that our tap tempo screen comes up. And our light, so if I go like slow, the light should slow down. There we go. And if we go fast, the light should speed up. So if you just want from your MIDI controller to emulate tapping the tempo button on your QC, this is it. CC44, any value just to show, I'll pick a random value, 73. It has nothing to do with setting the actual tempo. It's just emulating the physical stomp. But if you have a MIDI controller, you have something capable of generating MIDI clock, then I don't recommend you do that at all. I would suggest just leveraging MIDI clock from the device that you have. So option 2 is use the MIDI clock from some external controller. And the way you know the QC is getting MIDI clock is when this light is green now, it turns blue when it's syncing from an external source. So let's set up using the MIDI clock from the MC8. And we can leave this on press, and you can see we've got two options here, clock tap and MIDI clock. Let's go right now, just clock tap. And you can see there's sort of no settings for that, no expanded settings. You just say I want to have this be essentially tap tempo for my MC8. And you can see the current MIDI clock setting on the MC8 is displayed over there on the right. So if I start tapping this now, you'll see this changes and this starts flashing, but also on the QC, the tempo light has changed from sort of that greenish to a blue. Hopefully that's coming through on camera. and they are flashing in sync. Now, they are not synchronized, right? Like you can't expect when this is on, the light to be on, and when that's off, the light to be off. They are blinking at the same tempo, but they're displaying it slightly out of sync. The good news is that doesn't matter. It's not like the tempo will be the same. If you have a delay sync to this, it's going to work, even if these lights aren't flashing, perfectly. Let me just go with something like really fast. So you can see it took a moment there for the QC to sync up to that really fast tempo change, and then we'll go really slow. I guess that's not really slow. 100 BPM isn't like super slow, but it dropped down there. So let's go slower still. There you can see better sort of that, the discrepancy between the flashing on the MC8 and on the QC, but they should remain pretty much in sync. However far off they are, they should stay that far off. And so now, instead of trying to send messages to the QC only, we're setting the tempo on the MC8 and then sending it to the QC via MIDI clock. And what that lets us do is if we have additional MIDI devices or if we have anything else, we have one source of truth. Just sending tap tempo to the QC will change tempo there with varying degrees of success or accuracy, depending on latency and other things. But doing it this way ensures that every device that you're controlling via MIDI is going to have the same tempo. And you could do this same thing from a DAW. You can set up sending MIDI clock from your DAW. If you're playing to like a backing track and it has tempo changes or whatever, the QC will receive those messages the exact same way. There's nothing to set up. I didn't have to turn on like receive MIDI clock. It's just ready to get it. If it senses it on the MIDI stream, it will start syncing to that. Now, one question is, how do I stop this? And what I want to show you is I have nothing programmed on B. You can see up here. I don't know if that's actually going to stop it. Okay, good. I can change on the editor. I have nothing programmed on B. But if I press B, you'll see our light goes back to our green tint, and the MIDI clock tap tempo sort of flash on the MC8 stops. Well, why? I didn't tell it to stop, right? If I come back here, it's back on, and the QC light changes to blue, and I'll press C, and it stops. So if you want, let's say I had this set up for scene control or stomp control for a song, but I needed to be able to tap tempo because there's a tempo change in the song at some point, or there's a breakdown that speeds up or slows down. And I want to be able to change scenes, but I want to keep everything synced to my current MIDI clock. You need to come up here in controller settings, and in this general configuration, you need to check this box that says MIDI clock persist. Okay, so we turn that on. I'm going to have to restart the unit. So I'll be back. You guys don't need to see that. Okay, and we're back after a quick restart of the MC8. And so now let's tap tempo. And we'll see that our QC is still syncing. But now if I press preset B, MIDI clock keeps going. And I can press C and D. So MIDI clock persist is because the default operation is that only on the preset you have active, if you have MIDI clock settings on that preset, will they persist and be active. If you switch to another preset, it's considered that those MIDI clock settings are invalid. So if you want things to persist across multiple preset changes, you need to enable that setting in your general config. But what this also means is if you ever want to turn that off, if you want to turn MIDI clock off, you have to explicitly do that. So let's set up D here, and we can just do this on press as well. We can come down to this MIDI clock setting, and well, that's the default. So there's this MIDI clock stop, and yes. So let's call this, stop. And if we save that now, you can see our MIDI clock is going. And if I press it, do I need to be disconnected for this? Let's try that. Oh, okay, great. Another one of these, another quirk. I didn't realize that was going to require me to be disconnected. So if I tap tempo here, you can see we start sending clock again, and the QC syncs to it. The light goes blue. And then if I press D, well, if I press C, B, nothing happens. I'm still sending clock. If I press D, we stop. We stop on the MC8, and the QC goes back to green. Boy, okay. There's going to be a lot of connect and disconnect, I think, then. Because this MIDI clock setting is what I want to store. MIDI clock tap is just what it says on the tin. You set that up if you want to have a tap tempo button, just like I did here. But if you enable that persist, that MIDI clock persist, you will need some way to stop it. The better implementation would probably be a long press. So let's set that up. We'll we'll clear out D, and we'll just set up a long press to stop. And we're going to do MIDI clock, stop. Yes. And I'm going to need to disconnect. So let's test that. So if I tap here, we set our tempo, QC syncs. If I press and hold, we stop. There we go. So now you can have both of those functionalities on one switch. Probably a cleaner way to do it. Now let's dig into some of those options in this MIDI clock thing. I'm just clearing this to save it. We're gonna work from left to right. I'll just call this MIDI clock. So one thing you can do is you can essentially put the MC8 into a whole MIDI clock mode. And that's if you show this tap menu, you have a couple settings here. Use the current BPM setting. You can override that. So we're going to say, we'll leave it at no for right now. Let's just do that. I'm going to have to disconnect. And now what you see is when I tap this, we get a whole menu of BPM up, down. Do we want to save it as the default for this current preset? Do we want to exit this mode and then starting, or I don't want to say starting or stopping. Once you get in here, you start it, and then this becomes a tap tempo button. So you can see the clock is not running because the QC light is green. If I hit start, now it's syncing to MIDI beat clock. I can tap up or down. And you can see things get into a weird state here where I noticed this before. This may be a QC bug at low tempos. You can see it's changing between green and blue. I hope you can see it. Yeah, well, you can at least see two shades of light there. But you can tap or you can press and hold and scroll. And then if you let go, things get a little faster. So it seems like at very low tempos, the QC has like glitches out on the BPM and the lights flash. So if I ramp this up, things work pretty much fine. And you can go up or down here, press and scroll, or you can just have a tap tempo over here and we can speed things up, and you can see the QC also speeds up with that. Now we can choose to save that, right? BPM 146 saved. And then we can exit. And I think when we come back into this, if I change this, slow it down, and then we come back into here, it goes back to 146 on here. Now it doesn't, and it's not started. So, but it comes back to 146, and then I get to start it from this menu. And now the QC speeds up. So you can have this whole mode if you want to set, configure, and save BPM on the MC8 as well. Don't know if that's useful, but I did want to show it. So playing off of that, you don't have to show the menu, but you can set it, and you can see it really did save 146 as our BPM. So we can save 100 in here and say, don't show the menu, don't stop the MIDI clock. We want to keep it playing. Just set the BPM to 100. And you can see our current clock is 46. Disconnect. If I press this, we immediately go to 100 and we start sending MIDI clock. So you could have, you can call this 100 BPM and save it. And then you could make C, 140 BPM. And set up the same thing on a press. MIDI clock. We want this to be 140. Don't show the menu, don't stop it. And so now we have those two. I'll disconnect. And I can press this and we go to 140. And I can press this and we go to 100. So if you know within a song or something, you have very fixed rates. And again, you could assign these to all to one switch. You could have a press be one thing, a double tap be another, a long tap be another, a long press and hold. So you could set up multiple fixed tempos on a single switch as well. I'm just calling them out here so that we can have different labels. The other thing I want to show you for doing tap tempo is you can have a label. So let's go to E. If you want to show, I think this is right. I think it's % BPM, and then disconnect. And then you can see, maybe it's just BP because there's an extra M there. Hold on. Is it just BP? Yes. So it's BP, BPM is what we can put there. And that will reflect the current MIDI clock. You have it over there, but that might be of use. I just thought that was an interesting thing. So there are a lot of shortcuts like that, like formatted strings that you can use in the labels on your MC8. We'll cover more of that again in future sessions, but I did want to introduce that because it might be useful. And honestly, with that, I think that covers pretty much everything we can do here. You know how to stop, you know how to show the menu and control, and you know how to set a fixed BPM using MIDI clock here. We know how to make that MIDI clock persist across different presets through our controller settings. Over here, MIDI clock persist. And we know how to send just raw tap tempo signals to the QC via CC. And I think that really covers tempo control between this controller and everything else. And like I said, my recommended way, even if you only have the QC, if you're using this MIDI controller or any other MIDI controller that supports MIDI clock out, just use that. Don't emulate the tap tempo CC over on the QC. Use this clock, let it be your one source of truth. You're going to have more immediate feedback and more accurate control of tap tempo directly on this device than you are trying to forward those messages to other devices. So that's it. Trying to keep it short today and quicker than the other one. Well, shorter than the last one. And hope you guys find that useful. See you on the next one.